Good morning, everybody. I'd like to introduce myself firstly. My name is Nicholas Cobb. I am the conference manager for EMC 2021, which was, of course, 2020. But sadly, due to the COVID ongoing crisis, we've moved to next year. And in place, we have this wonderful series of webinars, which really have to date been a great success. And we'd like to welcome you all again on behalf of the EMC team, and it's a great pleasure today to introduce you all to our speakers. So the format for today will generally be, as with our previous events, a series of presentations from our three panelists, then followed by an interactive Q&A. So on the system you have in front of you, on the Zoom system, you'll be able to type in your questions, live questions as well. And what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to then field those questions if they're not directly related to the speaker and their presentation. Don't worry, we'll come to you. We'll move it through to the post presentation Q&A. So as I say, a very warm welcome to you all. And just a couple of house rules. Please remain muted and keep your phones on silent. And essentially, let's kick off. So today's topic, today's topic is a natural one, really. Already during our webinar series, we've explored the outlook for the Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas from an operational and commercial and a policy perspective. We've also covered quite a bit as well in terms of, technological solutions, what's required. And also sort of deep dived into some of the practicalities of doing business in the region. And today's topic really is a natural extension of the topics that we've already discussed. And today we'll be looking at the energy transition outlook for the region, Eastern Mediterranean region, as well as the wider Mediterranean. So what do we mean by this? Essentially, it's the embracing of cleaner and more sustainable energy fuels, embracing of natural gas, and what ties in with that. So it's the demand, it's the supply, it's the investment, it's the project infrastructure. It's a whole bunch of things that we can discuss here. But energy transition is a key hot topic within the energy sector. So it makes sense that we explore that, given the priority for the move towards cleaner fuel and energy development as outlined by the European Union and others. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our three speakers. Firstly, I would like to introduce Mr. Ashutosh Shastri, Director of ENERSTRAD Consulting, Philip Nutman, Managing Director of QED, and Elfriede Corrivelibus from DNV. She is a Business Development Manager for Oil and Gas for Mediterranean region. And we're going to start off today with Elfriede. So Elfriede, the floor is yours. Good luck with your presentation. And today she was very kindly will be speaking about the outlook for demand and energy from a European perspective and a European dimension. So the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much, Nick, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here and joining the first time this conference by web base. In the past, we were visiting Cyprus. Very nice. I hope we will manage to do it next year again. Let me share my screen, please. Okay. Well, I've been asked to give a scenario on how we see the transition to cleaner energy in the region, particularly on the Eastern Mediterranean. So as you know, DNV has been performing an outlook and forecasting how will be this transition from these days till 2050. So I will present you some views on this. As today we are talking about the impact of COVID and on the energy, I can say that in practice, as all of us know, the pandemic has a very great impact on the global economy. That means that we'll have some contractions on this year in terms of growth, as well as on energy demand. In practice, we predict that for this 2020.
Sorry, apologies, Alfreda. Just been informed that your screen has not been shared.
How can be?
Um,
Sorry. Can you see it now?
No, it's not coming from my side. Okay, something. Yep. Okay, yep, working now.
Okay,
thank you.
Sorry. So as just as a recap, I mentioned that in practice we expect that that the impact of the COVID will also cause some reduction on the energy demand. That's around 8%. This is mainly related to uses of the energy in the aviation sector, as well as the commuting and the office space. What we see that this impact will remain on the coming years. So it is something that will reduce less demand in terms of energy consumption for the coming years as well. So we are talking about 6 to 8% reduction from the previous forecast data and numbers. Together with this impact in terms of energy consumption, we have on some way also a positive impact in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions. As you can see here, we were expecting some peak on the CO2 emissions on the coming years, but after the COVID-19, the result is that we will never reach, at least that's our estimation, we will never reach the levels that we had in 2019 in terms of CO2 emissions. And the reduction that we have this year will remain, and we will avoid around 75 gigatons of CO2 on the coming 30 years. That is, in gross numbers, we can consider that there are emissions of around 2 years of global emissions. So that is good on one way, but it's not sustainable due to the impact that it has on the economy and on the population, and causing a lot of suffer in the globe. I'm trying to go to the next one. Okay. As we are talking today about the impact of COVID in East Mediterranean area, I think it is important to point out the key drivers in Europe in terms of energy and climate change. As you can see here, we have a strong focus on the clean energy package. We intend to have carbon prices by 2030. There is a lot of push for a strategic vision on a clean planet for all. We can see that there is a huge focus on switching to renewables, many types of renewables that can go from wind to solar, and a mix of them on the energy. There is also on the European policies some focus on CCS technology and development. Even so, we know that these will be more available or used just around 2030, because there technology is there, but it's not affordable right now in terms of cost. And then very important focus on hydrogen. We are talking about decarbonization, and hydrogen is one of the vectors here, mainly talking about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen. Finally, but not less important, we have a strong focus on gas imports and LNG terminals, because this will impact, this will increase, and the LNG is considered to be, and is right now going, the transition fuel through this more clean and green European perspective. Let me try. Okay. Even so, you can see here our forecast, and what we see is that in Europe, we will still need a lot of fossil fuels. You can see on the right side that, for example, we will have a reduction in terms of consumption, mainly on coal, as well as in regarding the oil. We see that the oil will go still ahead. We will use it, but the peak that we had in the past, we will never go back to that peak. Going to what is the focus of the EastMed in terms of energy and resources that we have there, you can see that the gas, Europe is importing a lot of gas, and there is need of gas in Europe, because we currently, and our expectation is that with resources that we have in the region, are not enough to cover all our needs, even if we are going in a transition period to more renewables. Right now, we are, as you know, importing gas from Russia, from Africa, from other countries. So I think there is the space. We believe that EastMed can contribute to these gas needs, and also secure gas needs. So even so, you will see here on the coming slide that we foreseen that we will have some decline in terms of coal, oil, but gas will continue growing, as well as the renewable, the non-fossil fuels. And that is because we need energy. We will continue needing this. We see that, for example, we expect that for 2050, we will have around 30% of gas as a resource. I'm talking here with global numbers, not just in Europe. So we expect a big growth on gas natural consumption, at least till 2030, 32, more or less. That is the forecast. Then you will see that the consumption will go a little bit going down, but in any case, we need gas, and that is the opportunity for the EastMed. This forecast was delayed, was switched down a little bit due to the COVID, but in any case, we will continue needed gas in Europe. Coal will continue being needed mainly in regions like Great China and India, and as well as oil in some sectors, but we expect that the maximum demand of oil will be around 2023, then it will decline partially. Mainly this is due to change on the transport sector needs. If we can go to the next one. So what we see is that there will be many transitions. As you can see here, we passed to, that was okay. We can go to the next one. Okay. You can see that we will need some oil. We will continue need the oil, but now in the coming years, what we will see from now till 2025, it will be that there will be a big fight to produce oil at the cheapest price. And we have some regions like Middle East, North Africa, Eurasia, and North America mainly producing oil and exporting them. So this is something that we need but the big fight here, it won't be on who is producing more oil, but who is producing the cheapest oil. And then you can see different colors here because there will be obviously some exchange of this fuel between different regions. In our area, mainly we have, predominantly North Africa and Middle East pushing together with Eurasia in this. Going to oil, from the oil to the gas, you will see here that we expect that we will continue having growth in terms of gas imports, gas consumption till 2030. There will be a lot of exchange between gas producers and gas consumers. We see that we will have a lot of investments on the coming years. I mean, the peak will be around 2030. So the most investments will come in the coming 2-3 years if countries and companies want to produce gas. This is, we know that in this 2020, due to the pandemic, many of the investments was on gas developments were postponed. Most of them, I will tend to say, but also what we see is that gas is there, we need this, so there will be, as soon as this pandemic is passing and the economy is recovering, there will be a big launch to produce and exchange and sell more gas. We see a lot of interaction between regions. Again, US, North Africa, and Middle East are the main exporters here. We see that, for example, we expect that Eurasia will supply some gas, still supplying some gas to Europe, as well as to China. But what we see is also that there will be a lot of, most of the exchange of gas in a region will be through pipelines and not through LNG. So LNG will be developed massively in US as they intend to export. What we see in Europe and in the region is that regasification facilities will increase. There will be some investment on this because the gas is the transition fuel to go to the Green Deal, as we said. So if I might move to the next one, yes. Here there are some key points that I consider for the EastMed. In practice, there is a space for the EastMed gas to be used in Europe. Natural gas is the vector for decarbonization, so matching perfectly what we have in Europe, and then we have to use what we have in terms of resources in the area as much as we can. There is a great opportunity to mix fuels. Another driver in the Mediterranean is the maritime sector, because they have very big goals in terms of decarbonization. So the gas coming from the EastMed could support in this. Obviously, we will need to have an agile approach. Price is the key issue. We need some cooperation. So we know that the reserves in the EastMed are not as large as in another regions as single fields, but collaboration and cooperation between companies or producers, governments is needed. And the key driver will be clear rules and policies in order to speed the investment. That is the key driver, and probably that is something that was weak in the past years in the region. That's my personal view on this, in what's going on in the Mediterranean. But There are good news, because if you see on the coming slide, what we expect for 2050 is that we will have around 50-50 between fossil fuels and renewables as energy global supply. Part of this fossil energy, around 5%, will be decarbonized. That will bring us 50 renewables and 50 fossil fuels for 2050. So gas is there. We have some opportunities. We have to go for those. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer any questions, and thanks to all. Nick, please. Floor is yours. Nick, you are mute, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So Elfriede, thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation, actually. And I think it really helped to set the scene for the next two presentations that we have to look forward to. I mean, I just had a very, very quick question before we move on to the next query. Sorry, the next presentations. In terms of capital projects, so for a good example, I know it's out of the region, but say take Nord Stream 2. Been under a lot of political pressure with Navalny and German business lobbies, etc. But I mean, from a demand perspective, do you see those sorts of projects maintaining speed?
Yes, I think we really need some gas supply. I don't know what will happen with Nord Stream 2, particularly as political matters, but what I can see is that we need the volumes of gas, even if they will come from Nord Stream or from other sources, but gas is needed.
Thank you. So we have, and just as mentioned, actually, I'll take some questions as they come up that are pertinent to each individual presentation. So we have a question here from Michelle Capabianco, and they're asking, oh, what is the possible role of CNG? Do you see a role for CNG in the area?
Yes, I think, thank you for the question. We see some CNG initiatives and projects going on. It is already there. The key question is the cost, okay, for CNG. And then the infrastructure. We really need a lot of support on smaller investments, I will say, in different areas of the region. Also because CNG can give us some flexibility in comparison to other larger investments or plants. Okay, so yes, I will say yes.
Thank you, Frida. Michelle, I hope that answers your question, and if not, please do feel free to add in. And we have another question here from Mr. Demetrius. Regarding Elfrieda's presentation, can you please advise if the impact of the oil price is modelled on the projections of future demand? So, Mr. Demetrius, we'll answer this question live for you.
Yes, of course. We know that that the oil is driving prices, also for gas, as we know. This will drive some of the future prices, but also we see some deviation in not immediately, but in the coming years. I think on after 2023. And what we see, probably Phil or Astos will go deeper on this later on the coming presentations, but we see that one of the impact of the COVID is on the type of pricing and the type of contracts that we are having now for the gas, where shorter contracts and the spot market are leading in comparison to the previous longer agreements.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so from Mr. Gerard Orpen, can you please, Wilson? Okay, yes, thank you very much, Mr. Gerard. We'll do that, not a problem. Okay, so Elfriede, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be more questions, but now we're going to move over to yourself, Philip. It's a great pleasure to introduce Mr. Philip Nutman, our Managing Director of at QED. He has some 30 years of experience in the energy sector, both within the industry directly and within the sporting industry. So he's worked for British Gas, Total, as well as PwC gas strategies. He's the managing director of QED, which stands for Quality Energy Development, and they specialize in international gas and energy sector consulting. It's been involved in a large number of transactions and projects in the East Mediterranean area, and has a keen interest in developments in that basin. So the focus for today will be viewing very much on the development of gas prospects and projects from an investor's perspective. So we'll be looking now through the East Mediterranean through the lens of an investor, potentially. So Philip, over to you.
Nicholas, thank you very much for that. I wonder if the sharing may work better this time around. If I can get it onto the proper one. Okay, excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invite to EMC. And as Nick has just foretold, I wanted to spend a little time today just considering the potential impact of COVID and cleaner energy awareness on investments on the for the regional gas projects. My objective is not so much to attempt to read any crystal ball here, but to try instead to focus and signpost what the likely key challenges are going to be, the issue areas that are going to concentrate the minds of the investors as they look forward now for potential new investments in the region and in the sector, and how we might begin to address those in order to take some of our investment opportunities forward. Just very briefly then, a few words on QED for those of us who've not come across our firm before. So we've been established a little over 10 years now. We are strategically and commercially focused advisors to the energy sector with a special focus around the natural gas and LNG sector. And as Nick has already said, the D stands for developments. So we specialize in both project developments and market developments, and in particular around emerging economies and markets that are under transition, if you like, normally in a growth stage, I have to say, rather than the perhaps some of the more established markets. And indeed, this is where we see a lot of challenges for new investments coming forward. QED and its core team members have a long history within the region, and most recently perhaps in Egypt, helping the government and the authorities there on their market structuring, liberalisation, and the regulations, which hopefully, as they move forward now, will be able to facilitate more investments and more gas trading in the region. In my own case, my experience of the region goes back quite a long way, back to the end of the 1990s, where I was heavily involved in advising the Israeli government in their own establishment of a new natural gas sector there. So let me start by picking up on a slightly different view from some of the slides that Alfreda has shared with us already, and this obviously is just focused on the natural gas side here. And all I really wanted to illustrate here is the uncertainty of what's out there. I'm not nearly brave enough to put any sort of projection out there at the moment as to what I think will actually happen on gas demand, because I'm really not very certain about that. And I think that reflects a lot of what people are seeing in the market, and certainly from the investment community. They're hearing a lot of different and conflicting stories about what may be happening, and therefore it is a little difficult to see exactly what they might expect to happen in the future. It's good to have that focus around there is this transition and natural gas has a play, but I think from an individual development and investment perspective, then clearly there needs to be a bit more focus around, well, what does that mean for us? Because at the end of the day, one thing that doesn't change with the natural gas sector is that investments tend to be long-term. There are big capital investments to be made, and they will require extended payback periods. And therefore you need to have some sort of view, if not how things will exactly turn out, how that risk will be managed going forward. And this is the challenging context in which we would like to look at new investments and new projects. And this is where the investors themselves will be coming from. So for the purposes of today, I wanted to concentrate on three primary challenge areas that are perhaps the most impacted by the changes that we've seen instigated by the impact of COVID. Changes which are, in my view, in any case happening. In any case, we're already there as drivers, and there was an awareness of each of these. So it's not new in that way, but what certainly has happened over the last few months is we've seen a greater emphasis on looking at these areas, and the likely impact of some of these has come forward. So we're now having to look at things that may be happening in the nearer future, perhaps. We thought, well, that will happen sometime out. We can still continue business as usual. The business as usual case really has shifted somewhat over the last few months. So those three areas that I want to talk a bit more on now. First of all will be on the robustness of gas demand. So this will drive, if you like, the volumes and therefore the revenue line from an investor point of view. And there are a number of aspects that I'll talk about here. We've already talked about the European markets, but of course there's the local, the regional market as well we need to talk about. There's the balances in terms of supply demand, how they may project forward. We've already talked about the uncertainty around that. Competition, as LNG has become much more of a commodity, then the competition is not just pipeline to pipeline, but obviously with LNG projects as well. And then the underlying policies that will drive further investments and changes within the energy sector and how that might impact on gas. The second area of key challenges will be the competitiveness of individual gas projects. So again, we'll talk a bit about the LNG and pipeline gas competition. But here the change is not so much that the project economics need to be looked at, because everyone's used to having to look at that when they go to their investment. The lenders and the investment committees, project economics is always front and foremost. Obviously, in a competitive environment where demand in the medium term may start to move down, as we've seen from the previous presentations here, then that's going to become more difficult. But perhaps it's something that we're used to looking at. What is more interesting, perhaps, is to dwell a little bit on the carbon credentials. And what I'm going to be saying there is really, I expect the focus of investment committees not just to be solely around the project economics going forward, but you need to have a good story in terms of your carbon credentials and your impact on the environment from a carbon perspective, if you're going to get their attention. Final area that I want to talk about, obviously, is the energy transition itself. So again, this is, what is the role for gas and low carbon gas going forward? And as Elfrieda's already mentioned as well, the potential impact and interaction with hydrogen. So the first key challenge area is demand. And this is not all or nothing, but there is a market choice sat in this region, which is a positive thing from a developer's point of view. And the gas can either go to the bigger European market, Southeast European market, can be accessed from the region, and obviously the gas can also go locally. So if we are considering the bigger European markets to begin with, there's some pros and cons around this. The pros around this are, and I don't think there's too much doubt about this, that whatever your projections are, there's more supply required and a greater deficit. and the numbers around that, of course, will change. But nevertheless, there is a big existing market demand there, and it cannot be met by existing supplies. So there is the potential there. And in terms of the scale of that potential, it's relatively big compared to the production projects that we have in place here. So that's a positive thing. The other positive areas are all around the state of the markets themselves, the regulations, and the transparency, at least, of that pricing. So if you can bring the gas to market, then the volume offtake will be there, and there is transparency and ease of access to move that gas and trade that gas within those markets. On the negative side, or the challenge side, if you like, there are a lot of supplies both in place and competing to supply that deficit going forward. So competition is going to be there, and of course that's going to have an impact in terms of price levels that might be attained. We've talked about the uncertain gas future. Obviously, in Europe itself, perhaps they've been better than other jurisdictions in terms of their own carbon credentials and laying out some sort of a path towards a low carbon future. So that, of course, increases perhaps the uncertainty in particular for gas projects. Other jurisdictions, other countries may well move not quite as quickly as Europe is planning to do at the moment. And the other challenge, of course, from a physical perspective, is the gas does have to be moved to the market, and there will be higher costs of access in order to move that gas. So those are some of the pros and cons about the decision to take it to the European markets. On the other side, if you look at the regional markets, then again on the pros, much easier from a physical point of view to move it towards the market, low costs associated with that. The competition in terms of other imports, obviously we have seen that before, and Egypt is an example where LNG has moved in, but there isn't as much competition as there is in for instance, the European markets. And I don't have up-to-date growth projections for these markets, but it's fair to say that because we are largely talking about emerging markets again, then the potential growth, certainly in the economies, but also for gas within those economies, are probably more positive than we see in more mature markets such as Europe. The challenges, on the other hand, for the regional gas markets are that the volumes that are required are much lower. Now, that may suit some of the smaller projects here, but we are talking about some of these projects, deep water, relatively large reservoirs, and perhaps the volumes are going to be difficult to handle in large lumps. That is more of a challenge for the regional markets than it would be taking it to Europe. The other area is limited or variable, let's put it that way, liberalization within those markets. I mentioned before that we've been working in Egypt over the past few years to try and move their market and regulatory structures along. There is still some considerable work to do there, not least the historical price subsidies that effectively within the largest markets, regional market of Egypt, have been in place. That has been addressed and is being addressed, but it's still a few years away from being in a place where the market's prices or the prices are reflective of market conditions and can be easily related, let's say, to the international gas price. So there are some challenges around there. If we move on to talk about the second key challenge area, and that's a competition. I think we used within Europe seeing some competition around there around the against pipeline supplies imported compared to indigenous, and then the various locations of those pipeline imports. What we're seeing more and more of, obviously, is LNG coming into the region. And this map just gives a sort of overview of a mix of existing and under development and planned LNG import facilities around the region. And so we see already that there's quite a bit of activity there, and that just illustrates the sort of competition that we're going to be seeing going forward for any new gas supplies going into the region. If we can try and start to put around some numbers and some economics around the picture here, the left-hand side of this slide here, we can see a sort of build-up, an indicative build-up of prices for LNG coming in, and in this case, what we've concentrated on is the, if you like, the price setter, which is LNG coming from the US. Now we've taken there as an example Henry Hub price of $3. $3. I think many producers in America would have loved to get $3 over the last couple of years. But nevertheless, prices at the moment are creeping back towards that sort of level, and it's a reasonable sort of medium-term estimate for what that might be. If you then take the operating costs, the transportation costs on top of that, then you get to a delivered price into Europe as a minimum of around sort of $4.5 to $5, and then depending on the amount of price you can extract over and above that level, that will dictate the contribution they make towards their liquefaction fees, because having put that metal in the ground, of course, then they're going to take whatever price they can get above the operating costs, but only if they get prices up towards $7 or $8 are they actually getting full payback as planned in terms of their initial capital investment. So the pressure is also on there to get prices up, but as we've seen in Europe, there is a stubbornness about it, and whilst there is an excess of LNG demand, which I don't really see changing very much over the next few years, then it's unlikely that we're going to see much movement away upwards again towards $7 or $8. Now, if we take a slightly tighter scenario in terms of the global gas and LNG balance, then maybe we see that prices, for instance, start to move up. We see LNG prices in the Asian market, perhaps if they start to if they reflect still an oil price, and let's say we take a $60 to $70 per barrel oil price, then you can net back, if you like, your LNG exports from the US again as the price setter, and that would give you prices around the $7 to $8 in terms of European hub prices. All right, so you can see as we move towards a tighter outlook for LNG supply demand on an international basis, then perhaps we'll start to see prices move up within Europe towards $7 or $8 price. But I mean, I don't think the market's expecting that to happen over the next few years, perhaps towards the end of the decade before we start to see that. And obviously that does depend on what else is happening in the market. There's a lot more LNG production capacity that could come on stream in that period if prices do start to move in a positive direction. So we'll have to see how that happens. But from the perspective, obviously, then of the gas producers in the East Med region, European prices around $4 or $5. It's difficult to see how that's going to be something that the investment community is going to be comfortable with. So if that's your target market, then they're going to want to see some sort of European indication in terms of markets moving towards $7 or $8 perhaps for them to feel very comfortable about it. So timing is going to be really important in terms of when new prospects from the East Med region might be coming to the market. I think the other thing to bear in mind is obviously COVID has had something of a dampening effect, as we've already seen from Elfrieda's slides. So that will tend to push out when we would have otherwise expected to see perhaps some sort of an increase in prices again towards generally more economic levels. But as I mentioned, it's not just the economics that I think investment committees in particular are going to be interested in seeing here. They're also going to be looking now at a much wider perspective. So we're going to continue to see competition between gas projects for the monies that's going to be available. There are challenges within the investment communities as to how much now may be going towards the hydrocarbon sector generally. So carbon credentials within that are going to be very important. So it's not just about saying, okay, can we get a strong or robust economic case for our project when we go to the investors? We also need to be able to say we have done everything that we can in terms of minimizing the impact on the environment, and in particular the carbon story for our project. How do we compare now with other projects bringing new gas onto the market as regards the impact on the carbon picture? And those carbon credentials are going to be another important element that must be considered and must be part of that story. It's more than just price now. So the third area that I said I wanted just to touch on is the energy transition and the future role of low carbon gas. And Nord Stream 2 has already been touched on here, and I'm not involved in that, so I'm not going to give an opinion as to what may or may not happen on it. But I think I would just make a couple of observations there, just in terms of what's been said around it, and in particular by the likes of Gazprom as the main instigator behind the project. And they have attempted to highlight both the robustness of the project in terms of how it will be able to adapt to the changing environment from a carbon point of view, to the extent that they're saying 70 or 80% of the gas flowing through here could be hydrogen rather than methane. So they're attempting to do that, but that does two things, I believe. Firstly, it is in terms of this robustness that we've talked about, the economic robustness, even if there's an issue for methane, traditional natural gas markets going forward, this particular infrastructure investment will still be robust because there's going to be hydrogen production, again, coming from Russia that can come to Europe through this facility. So it adds, if you like, if that story is borne out, then it adds to the economic credentials and robustness of Nord Stream 2. And the second element really is more to do with winning people over, if you like. There are some, obviously, there's a lot of lobbying going on about this. There's a lot of political noise around the project. And again, using or attempting to use the credentials of the project in terms of its friendliness to the environment is, if you like, the second stream, I believe, of that strategy. So whether it's effective or not, I'm not going to speculate, but it's interesting that there's been obviously a lot of time and effort put into the importance of stressing the carbon credentials of that particular project. Now, when we talk about hydrogen, I'm not going to talk long on this at all, but it's going to become, I'm sure, an increasingly important part of the mix. And there is, in some ways, an expected transition towards H2. But it remains very uncertain at this stage, and it's very much in its infancy. And from an investment point of view, I'm sure the investment community is not really anticipating too much happening on this before the end of this decade. It is something which is a medium-term phenomenon as far as major investments are concerned. There's a lot of work to be done over the next few years in terms of moving there, improving things up. But in terms of major investments and new projects, that's much more likely to happen from 2030 onwards. So from the investment community is not so much going to be looking at, we're going to look at hydrogen rather than natural gas over the next few years. I don't think that's a credible outlook, but nevertheless, to demonstrate some sort of fit with the new world, both in terms of hydrogen, obviously, but also in terms of carbon capture and storage, is going to be an important part of anyone's story, any developer's story, when they're going out to the investments community. So in conclusion, this sort of completes my high-level thoughts of the impact of energy transition in a post-COVID world on the Eastern Mediterranean gas project investments. So the three challenge areas: the robustness, competitiveness, and the transition. These three were already known before we'd heard of COVID. All three have all been heightened, perhaps, by the impact of COVID. But all three can and should be addressed by any developers in order to effectively secure their own investments going forward. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions that might be at this stage.
Lovely, Philip. Thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating, and again, really very interesting indeed, because it was building on an awful lot there of what Frida had mentioned. It was great to see as well some of your comments about the pricing and the LNG, particularly from the US LNG market, which, as we know, is building speed. So, do any of the panelists have any questions for Philip, or for that matter of Frida, given I should have asked at the last after your presentation? Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll package them up to the end. But if any panelists or if any attendees do have any queries, then please do pop them into the bottom. But Philip, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now to our last but no means least speaker for the day. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ashutosh Shastri, and as some of you may have recognized, he was the chair for the last meeting. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Ashutosh. He's a founder of ENERSTRAD Consulting, which is a UK-based consulting firm and is focused on assisting clients to navigate the energy transition process. And he runs energy transition courses all over the world and speaks at many events. ENERSTRAD is specialized in energy policy, technology, and the finance space, with an emphasis on commercial policy and regulatory strategies. He is a distinguished fellow of the EPRANC, a member of the UN Group of Experts for Natural Gas and Clean Energy, and is a board member of the Global Gas Centre. He has considerable experience in the Eastern Mediterranean area in the regulatory and policy commercialization. So without much further ado, Ashutosh, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Samuela and IES, for inviting me to speak at this event. It's a great pleasure to be speaking on the subject of energy transition. When I first set up ENERSTRAD Consulting in 2003, the word energy transition was not in vogue. But the whole driver for setting up my consulting practice in 2003 was that there was what I viewed as the space for the energy sector was going to be policy-driven, policy-created space. And within this policy-driven, policy-created space, how do you actually effectively manage investments? Philip very eloquently has spoken about the challenges relating to investment. In particular, the role of gas in the energy transition process. I think it is pretty well known and universally accepted that gas has a critical role to play in the energy transition to a low carbon economy. What I'm going to do is expand the whole definition of energy transition, because what we are seeing today, energy transition is not just about decarbonization or getting more renewable energy into the picture. You know, I've been kind of working on this, and I kind of have looked at it. You know, consultants come with all sorts of ideas, but I call them what I call the 4Ds of energy transition. I'm not going to make a few very simple points in this presentation today. Very happy to take questions on carbon pricing, renewable energy auctions, role of gas, decarbonized gas. I think Philip made a very pertinent point about how investors will look at the greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas going forward, particularly when it comes to methane leakage. The US elections, it is an important aspect when it comes to US LNG exports, that, the upcoming US elections, the whole methane leakage and the greenhouse gas footprint of US LNG is already, in the, one of the key areas in the mix. I will start sharing my screen now, and can everyone see this screen now? Excellent. Thank you. So very quickly, what is ENERSTRAD Consulting? We look really at, not just electricity, carbon, gas, but the interrelationships between these different micro markets. And what energy transition is all about is managing that smooth transition from a certain level of carbon intensity, which is usually measured by the grid emission factor or the grid intensity of the system. We work across the policy. We work with governments, policymakers, done some policy design and writing assignments, but most importantly, we are kind of working in the commercial strategy advisory space. And so what intervention that I'll be making today will be reflective of the experience of the last few years in, helping regulators, regulated entities, as well as new entrants manage this whole process of energy transition. So I have a very few, and these are the only 5 points I would really like to make in today's presentation. First, which I have already made, is energy transition is not just about decarbonization of renewable energy. We will give an example of how even with having a big focus on renewable energy policy, you can end up with higher prices and not sufficient decarbonization, and that's important to understand. Then, within the policy community, particularly the economics research community, there has been a growing voice, and if you read what a number of institutions who are working in the institutional investor group and for climate change, etc., are saying that designing, implementing an energy transition program is easy because on paper the calculations look smooth, but the reality of the energy world and the reality of the investment world is investment is often lumpy. People are taking a bet against a particular policy. Policy can change. Policymakers speak to each other. They learn from each other's experiences, and therefore, it is never a straightforward program that you can have a very smooth energy transition. To give you an example, very recently there has been a problem in the California energy market. And 20 years ago, around the same time in the August of 2000, California also had an energy problem. Some of the factors that were then mentioned was the role of gas, the high gas prices, the role of Enron, all of that. Today it is climate change, but one of the underlying factors in California in the last 20 years, for example, which has not changed enough, has been the role of regulation that can provide the investment triggers that smooth flow of capacity can actually happen in the market. So the market has become tight, and the reserve margins dropped, both in the case of the year 2000 and in 2020. So just goes to show that even after 20 years, it is not always very straightforward to get energy transition right. And therefore, the risk associated with the energy transition process, its policy, is a fundamental risk when it comes to new investments in the region. I'm going to talk very briefly about the UK and the German experience in energy transition. I'm going to submit through the UK experience that, you know, a smooth transition is possible, but, you know, that smooth transition is actually, the best analogy is like a duck swimming on water. Policymakers are constantly having to make a lot of adjustments. Stakeholders are having to make adjustments. The market design in the last 20 years in the UK has changed 3 times, from a pool-based system to an exchange-based system to a CFD kind of a traded market kind of a system. I want to speak a little bit about the EU Green Deal as to how the EU Green Deal also now talks not just about decarbonization or renewable energy, but also talks about democratization, demand-side participation, the role of data and digitalization. And then I'm going to bring all of that to kind of show some really very early indicators of the challenge for energy transition in the East Mediterranean. So this is the slide I probably will spend the longest time on. I think my slides tend to be busy, so I will not kind of, you know, go through each slide in detail, but I know that they are going to be made available to you, and then I'm of course very happy to answer any questions that you may have. So how do we define what are the 4 Ds? Very simply, decarbonization, decentralization. Decentralization means that you no longer have to rely on lumpy investments of large projects, but, you know, renewable smaller projects get connected to the distribution system can also help you in the transition process. Deregulation and new market design, very straightforward. You know, deregulation has been going on in the East Mediterranean region and in the European region for a very long time. Digitization and digital transformation. You know, the more information you have about a particular asset, the more information consumers give about their consumption patterns, then, you know, the demand supply balance tends to change. So why did energy transition enter our lexicon? Because the demand for energy is growing, and, you know, you need to do it with less carbon. So the divergence in the curve has to happen, you know, and this is why energy transition became an important part of the, not just the energy policymakers lexicon, but, you know, the overall government policy lexicon all over the world. In the current post-COVID world, you know, what is going on, that those traditional 4 Ds of the energy transition have been, you know, complicated by the emerging 4 Ds. And the emerging 4 Ds, in my view, I will submit, are the deglobalization of trade. What you see as the contest for economic supremacy emerging between China and the US over the last few years is, you know, one such manifestation of the deglobalization. Make America great again, you know, looking at insourcing, you know, risk factors associated with global supply chains. So, you know, it is something to think about when it comes to the energy sector, because not just all dimensions of the energy sector actually rely on global supply chains. And what COVID-19 has forced all stakeholders to think about is what are the implications of this deglobalization of trade on the supply chains, and therefore what are the additional risks to new project developments. Depopulation in many energy economies. Now, depopulation or you know, lack of growth of population in the major economies is one aspect of it, but then again, that is offset by growth in the emerging world. About a year ago, BP in its annual statistical outlook in June presented a very interesting slide, how 80% of the world is concentrated in the low per capita energy consumption bracket. And only a few countries only the OECD countries and a few other countries are towards a much higher per capita energy consumption. So if you look at energy and, you know, economic development, then you see a larger chunk of the population, East Mediterranean being a perfect example of it, where per capita energy consumption is going to grow. And therefore, how do you manage this growth in per capita energy consumption with a reduction in carbon emissions is going to be an important challenge. Declining productivity, debt burden, I think, is becoming very obvious in a post-COVID world. I don't want to kind of, you know, create more depression, on this discussion any more than what we've already been through and are going through. But these are the complicating factors for energy transition in a post-COVID world. Now, just 2 slides to show that you will, when you talk about energy transition, you will come across several phrases, several terms, and the lexicon is only growing. Only yesterday, the World Energy Outlook was published by the International Energy Agency, the 2020, and the IEA has now come out with. This is how BP, for example, looks at energy transition. What are the different? They call it evolving transition, more energy, less globalization, rapid transition. The International Energy Agency had a sustainable development scenario, a stated policy scenario, a new policy scenario. The new policy scenario was a scenario where those policies were actually not in place yet. And yesterday's release of the IEA World Energy Outlook, they have now come at 2 more, different. They have included up to 2050 the scenario. So there is a sustainable development scenario. There is a net zero model scenario, which is for the first time has been published by the IEA. So now it is no longer about decarbonization, which is what the IEA was, the language the IEA was using until a few years ago. To, it is now about net zero, and therefore, how different. I've just made a few notes here that how different fuel sources are actually also included in this whole calculation. What is included? What do you, when you talk about renewables, do you include hydro or not? If you include hydro, do you include run-of-the-river hydro, or do you only include, smaller hydro projects? So all of these things actually are important in understanding, what that scenario includes or does not include, and what does it imply. And therefore, for any project developer, any regulator, any policymaker, any investor, to try and understand the nuances of these different scenarios is very important to understand. I think Philip very eminently showed the difference just looking at the gas demand globally in his presentation, how wide a variation you can see within the projections. So again, I'm not going to tie my thread to a particular scenario, but it's just to give you an indication as to what this transition actually means. Most companies look at this scenario from 3 lenses, and I particularly like the BP one because it talks about the end use, which takes into consideration how the situation or how the dynamics are evolving on the demand side, how are consumers interacting with energy, what is actually happening to the fundamentals of primary energy demand, and what is the interfuel competition, and how is it evolving. So I really feel that these 3 lenses are important to understand energy transition, particularly from a holistic point of view. Now, if you research energy transition, and this is something we talk a lot about in the courses that we run, that there is a growing voice out there with very prestigious names. The Energy Transitions Commission. Do Google the Energy Transitions Commission's website. It's a major effort. It is a very serious group of very serious economics experts who have come out with a report called Mission Possible. And they basically are saying that, a target well below 2 degrees centigrade is achievable. Net zero by mid-century is achievable. And so this report was released in the year 2017, 2018. And if you follow what has happened in the UK, for example, with its net zero strategy, or the European Commission now having announced its net zero strategy by 2050, to the IEA now kind of developing a scenario for net zero by 2050, you begin to understand the influence of these institutions as to how they are influencing a position that net zero is actually possible. I'm going to submit to you that while I'm not disputing that it is possible, I'm questioning whether is it probable, and that's the position that I am taking in this presentation. That 1%, it is going to cost you no more than 1 to 2% of your GDP. it's fine, but how are you actually going to manage the fuel transition? How are you going to make sure that your energy security, your energy reliability, and the pricing of your energy is also something that is acceptable to the society? Just to give you an idea, the world still is going to be consuming fossil fuels. I have been a Sherpa in the climate negotiations in 2009 in Copenhagen. And I have gone through a whole lot of detail about the IPCC reports as well. And I will wish to state only one simple fact, that even the IPCC fifth assessment report does not speak about a reduction in fossil fuels by mid-century. Or the non-existence of fossil fuels by mid-century. The IPCC position is that a little over 50% of global energy mix will continue to remain fossil dependent even by mid-century. And therefore, if you look at urbanization, the growth of China and India, the shift of the center of gravity for the energy trade towards the east, then it's kind of beginning to look pretty improbable that that this challenge is as easy as 1 to 1.5% of GDP, as has been claimed by many of these international institutions. The Paris Agreement, just a quick complicated slide to kind of give you the key messages that came out of Paris and how they are now getting incorporated into the global energy dialectic, is that it started saying, let's keep it well below 2 degrees C. Let's pursue for 1.5 degrees C achievement. Let's try to look at global peaking. When this whole idea of global peaking of emissions has been an old one, but I think in a post-COVID world, it has as we saw in the first presentation with Elfrida, she showed very clearly how the COVID has actually played a role in eliminating about 75 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And the European Union has very conveniently claimed that they have met their 2020 targets. Had the COVID crisis not happened, perhaps the outcome would have been different. So I'm going to make a very simple point that achieving growth in your economy and achieving a reduction in your carbon emissions is not always very straightforward. But if you look at the UK experience, then the UK data seems to indicate that it is possible. And why is this important? This is important because the UK is actually going to be the host of the next COP negotiations in November 2021. They were to be held in November 2020. Because of COVID, they have been postponed. For the first time, there is a gap of about 18 months or so between two subsequent conferences of party meetings. One hopes that this intervening period gives a pause for some reflection about what is realistic, what is achievable. But the UK, I expect, is going to demonstrate and is going to display its success in achieving an energy transition come November 2021. And therefore, the time period between now and November 2021 again is, I think, going to be very significant as far as the dialectic of the energy transition is going to be concerned. But the point that I'm going to make through this very complicated slide is that the UK did not achieve this transition in a space of 5 years or 10 years. The privatization of the UK pool happened in 1989. The seeds of the privatization were actually sowed in the winter of discontent of 1984. And the other markers that I've shown are only to show that the market design actually changed. So after the privatization of the pool, what you saw is the tremendous growth of gas-fired CCGT. Now, the trigger for gas-fired CCGT was driven not by climate change, was not driven by decarbonization, but was driven by the fact of that those were the most economically efficient capital investments to make, and the UK market design allowed or enabled these most efficient market design technologies to get deployed. The market design changed in the year 2000 to an exchange only, which is the NITA market. It continues to remain the main force for the market. But around 2012, 2014, that was a period when the electricity market reform happened in the UK, and the new technologies that you begin to see coming up particularly wind, offshore wind, hydro, solar, and new nuclear, actually have been triggered by the electricity market reform program. So the point I'm making as a case study is that energy transition does not necessarily involve choosing one market design and running with it, but you start to make targeted changes as things evolve. And energy transition takes a rather long time. It is not something you can achieve in 5 years or 10 years. And that is the reason why I feel that the IEA is also talking about mid-century. So it gives stakeholders, everybody involved in the business, to actually start to make those adjustments to achieve that end goal. This is how the UK decarbonization target looks like. It is a pretty impressive reduction in the grid emission factor. I have not come across any other economy in the developed world which has actually achieved this level of steep decline in the grid emission factor. As you can see, while the UK has actually achieved somewhere in the summer grid, in the summertime, the UK does not run its coal-fired plants. It has gone without coal through the summer for the last year now, and the grid emission factor is somewhere between 190 to 225 grams per kilowatt hour. In the winter, that grid emission factor goes to somewhere between 250 to 280, sometimes up to 300 grams per kilowatt hour. But just to give you an example, the German government has announced a huge success when its grid emission factor has now touched about 600 grams per kilowatt hour after being in the 800 grams per kilowatt hour for the last 20 years. So this is a slide I've taken from the UK's Committee on Climate Change report just to show you how the climate action in the UK is now coming up, how UK plans to become net zero by 2050, Scotland plans to become net zero by 2045. But this is one example of a transition process which has been long in the making and has happened systematically over a period of time. If you now look at the German situation, then the German decline or the German trajectory of primary energy consumption looks rather ambitious. And I think the chart just speaks for itself that the objectives of the Energiewende in Germany, the energy transition, are, whilst they are laudable, how this decline is going to be managed between 15 years, from 2015 to 2030, is going to be an extremely important challenge. And I think Germany is going to be a crucible, in my view, of the European experience of decarbonization. It is not to say that the Energiewende hasn't accomplished anything so far. Germany has achieved a huge increase in its renewable energy penetration. That is the experience that the European Union is now seeking to, develop and propagate across the European Union. And here is the scenario, or here is the analysis that I've done based on the very recently announced German Coal Commission proposals. And what I've done is, this is a 2030 scenario. It's a very simple scenario I've created to make a very simple point that even if you have all the renewables that have been announced by the German government so far, even if all of them were to go through, you would still be left with the blue corner or the blue element in the slide, which is 112 terawatt hours of new gas demand by 2030. So just to give you a scenario that today the German emission, 2018 German electricity sector is 546 terawatt hours. By 2030, according to the Fraunhofer Institute's projections of demand side participation and energy efficiency, the net consumption or the net system of Germany is still going to remain at 546 terawatt hours. So that reflects the identity, the number of 546 remaining the same reflects energy efficiency and demand side participation. The emissions, which reflect 235 terawatts of coal-fired coal production, they reduce from 235 to 77 terawatt hours, and as a result lead to an emission reduction of 256 million tons to 90 million tons, which is the coal phase-out obligation announced by the Coal Commission. So which means that, in order to meet this 546 terawatt hours of 2030 demand, about 112 terawatt hours of new demand is, which is not going to be met by renewables, has to be somehow be met. And so in order to arrive at this 112 number, what we did was, let's take into consideration all the renewable energy projects which are at the proposal stage, which are at the development stage. All of them actually are successfully completed. All the power purchase agreements are signed, and all these contracts are in place. Even then, Germany is left with a deficit of over 112 terawatt hours, or an additional gas demand of around 13.5 to 15 BCM per year. Now that, in my view, is the fundamental rationale which remains unchanged for the Nord Stream 2 project, or the expansion of the Nord Stream project. So the point I'm making here is not very dissimilar to the point that has been made by my co-panelists on this session, Philip and Elfriede, that gas is going to be an important linchpin of this energy transition process. But you are going to see this gas having to fight with a lot of renewable energy projects to find its place in the merit order. And therefore, achieving this end state is actually by no means going to be easy. So very quickly, how have these 4 Ds been incorporated into the new Green Deal that have been announced? This is a slide that I've picked up from the European Union's new Green Deal position paper. The new Green Deal in the European Union talks about a fiscal stimulus of 1.4 trillion euros between now and 2030 to achieve a net zero by 2050. And that's a very significant number, and therefore the finance available, or the public finance through the European budgetary support mechanism and extra budgetary mechanisms, makes it very possible that the next wave of investments in Europe is likely to be more renewables. Yesterday, the European Parliament, and I'm yet to confirm it, but I have seen this mentioned by Euractiv on Twitter, where they tweeted yesterday that the European Parliament has voted that no new projects of community interest in the European Union will, which have a fossil component, will be eligible for PCI funds. Now, that is a very significant statement. In those of you familiar with Yes Minister in Britain, I think it's a very courageous policy statement to make for a European Parliament. It calls into question, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Again, a Yes Minister phrase perhaps gives way to my fascination for Yes Minister and policy, but it's also that how is it actually going to be worked out? Would low carbon or carbon abated gas projects be exempt from this? Is this a strategy to kind of push hydrogen more for the network operating systems? What would be the implications for the European gas transport network of having to manage the kind of proportion of hydrogen in its system? So there are a lot more questions that have been raised by yesterday's announcement than there are answers. So unfortunately, I don't have many of them at this stage, but to the extent that I can help in this discussion, I will be happy to answer questions. I will conclude by a slide on the Mediterranean, or rather the East, particularly the East Mediterranean space. This is a slide that I've pictured, a screen grab from a report which has been published by the OME, where except for Turkey, and the blue bar is actually the hydro bar, and this is why it is important to understand what is included in renewable energy in a policy system in the transition, what isn't. And it basically tells you that the East Mediterranean region has an overall penetration of no more than 7% in terms of renewables. So it has a very long way to go. And according to the OME, the challenge to actually increase its renewable capacity is actually sixfold. So, although 170, as you can see from the slide, there is a sixfold challenge that renewable energy capacity in the region has to increase 6 times just to meet its stated targets. Now, if the East Mediterranean or the Mediterranean region as a whole, through the force of the European Union or otherwise, is in the propinquity of a much deeper level of renewable energy penetration, then it calls into question a very interesting competition between gas and renewable energy. It will be a in my view, a replication of the contest, the interfuel contest that we've seen in the case of Western Europe, where natural gas has been painted as the renewable energy's best friend, a bridge to the low carbon energy. And I will conclude by asking a question saying that while it is important and everybody recognizes the role of gas as a bridge to the low carbon economy, and it is an important element of the energy transition, not much is actually known about the architecture of this bridge. Is it a long, narrow bridge, or is it a short, fat bridge? One does not know. And that is where the uncertainties of the energy transition actually happen. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to answer questions. You can follow me. This is my Twitter handle. You can ask me questions. I'm happy to answer them. And I hope I have not taken shot too much of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashutosh. I think everybody was sort of roughly on time today, which is awesome. I've organised and chaired events around the world where timing doesn't really seem to have any any rule or regulation there at all. So anyway, look, I think we've had a wonderful discussion this morning, and we've really seen energy transition from a number of perspectives, from demand and policy to the practicalities of investment risk, right through to some out of region case studies that obviously, as a frontier basin, there may well be some transferable sort of knowledge parts and information there that could be well utilized. So look, without much further ado, I would like to open the floor then to questions. So if anybody from the floor have any queries or questions, please feel free to pop them into the box. If not, then please do get in touch afterwards. But I have a couple of pre-submitted questions to get the ball rolling, both from Philip earlier on. So we have, so what needs to happen within the Eastern Mediterranean markets to secure gas supply going forward? And that's to all of the panelists. What do you both think?
Well, let me just start with a couple of comments on this. I suppose if we're to look at the regional markets, then obviously volume-wise, it's dominated by one, which is the Egyptian market, and it's good news, if you like, from the gas developments perspective, that they have such a large market that is there, if you like, on their doorstep. Historically, Egypt has had some issues in terms of its own, if you like, market structure, which has led to the strange situation where, as a major gas producer, it was importing LNG in order to meet its own requirements at one stage, and that's the sort of thing that can happen when markets are less than open and perhaps overly managed. Now, as I said, they're going through the stages to free that up, and there's two major elements to that, and one is to do with the framework, the regulatory framework, and access to the infrastructure to enable new players to be trading in that market, and the second element relates to the removal of any sort of false pricing and subsidies that may be present, and putting in those structures in place, have a role perhaps in new markets and developing markets where one is trying to manage the risk, but in once markets are established, especially, then you can get these sort of strange signals coming out in terms of supply, demand, and pricing around that. And certainly Egypt is on the road now to a much more open framework and pricing, and that reflects economics, but it's not there yet, and certainly it would need to continue on that road to facilitate further major investments, if you like, for bringing gas into into that network. It's going to become challenging, if you like, to do it in the old pricing environment that's in place. Other places like the Israeli market, obviously, I mean they're oversupplied from their own production in any case, but I mean they've set that up from the outset as a much more open network in terms of access. So it does vary across there, but having those two things in terms of the pricing and access to infrastructure are both very important elements of being able to bring gas to those markets.
Thank you, Philip. Alfredo or Ashutosh, anything would you like to add to that, or mute?
Yeah.
Ashutosh, you want me?
Yes. Thank you, Nick. I agree with Philip's assessment that Egypt is a market which is an important market in the region. It is now going to be a net exporter and an importer of LNG, so it's going to play that role as well. It has had its problems with its LNG supply previously. The finds in the region. I'll take a slightly global perspective, and this is a question I have been asking in in the repeated EMC events. Is we know that the center of gravity for gas trade is moving globally to the east. The question for the developments in the East Mediterranean are how are they going to become a part of the global gas market? What would it take to actually connect them to the global market? Because connecting these investments to the global market, either by means of pension fund investments from the Japanese investors or the Korean investors, whatever shape or form, doesn't always have to happen in a contractual manner. But the global LNG market price mechanisms are moving in a certain manner. What exchange are they going to choose? Where is the reference price going to be? All these will remain important questions for continued for the continued economic success of these projects. And to that extent, this regional geopolitical competition, and I can say this without any bias, is that it's slightly pointless. What I call I like to call it not the gun boat diplomacy, but the drill boat diplomacy that we have seen of late in the region. It is frankly not helpful for anyone in the region. Unless the region connects itself to the global gas market, it just will be otherwise a marginal play in the global gas flows, and that will hurt the economics of these projects.
Thank you.
If may I add something, I think we have to keep in mind that we have new players, and they will have an important role on the East Mediterranean, starting from Israel, that is really moving fast. But we have also Cyprus and Greece with huge expectations and reserves of gas. So I think if we want to bring this East Med gas to the market, either to Europe or exporting out of Europe, I think price will be one of the drivers. Sorry, as well as collaboration among players and regulators. We really need some synergies in the area and in the region for this. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, thank you. So I have another question come in. So how will HH prices inevitably rise over a period of time, given the oil price slump and the fact that that's squeezed out many of the shale producers, or even temporarily?
Yeah, perhaps I can have the first stab at that, because I put up there the slide which is showing the sort of makeup of the prices of the US LNG coming to Europe and the impact that might have. And of course, the starting point is Henry Hub price, which has been at pretty low levels now for some time, as we've seen the sort of shale oil and gas revolution. But in some ways, I'm a bit split on this one. I mean, I've always been of the view that I don't really see how that can move very far north from where it is at the moment, simply because from a geological perspective, there's an awful lot more to come. And even as they move more towards the, if you like, the dry shale gas, and a lot of it's been coming from the wet areas where it's just been, if you like, associated gas with the oil. But even as they move into the dry basins, if they need to do so, then the vast majority of that is still very economic at certainly $4. So it's difficult to see that Henry Hub's going to move very far, very quickly on that, and I think any short-term increase in prices there will bring yet again more production and people getting pretty quick production back online again. So I think it would be a short-term blip for it to go much higher than that. But obviously, any major movement on that side would have a significant impact on global gas and LNG prices.
Thank you. Ashutosh, afraid to jump in first, right?
Yes. Not more to add in terms of, the view about the US, but just that, there is, I have seen at least two kind of episodes around 2011, 2012, 2014, 2015, where, the death of the US shale gas industry was kind of, called, saying, it's, at this level of pricing, this cannot survive. But what has always continued to amaze the non-US gas world is the efficiency, the capital efficiency, the way in which, the nature of competition in the US. That has something that has struck particularly the traditional players, Qatar, Russia, as that this is that the competition is still there, and the consolidation play in the US shale. So there is a race for efficiency, and so one thing which I can definitely say for sure about the future is that the US upstream environment is going to remain competitive. This price cycle, I can't see it rise immediately to a $7 or $8, which what the upstream investors are seeking. But at the same time, if the decarbonization plans around the world, and the most important indicator to that is actually President Xi's speech at the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago, where he said that China is now going to, and I take these statements seriously, because when someone like the head of state in China says that they're going to do it, the Chinese track record has been pretty good at actually achieving or doing what they say they are going to be doing. So if China aims to achieve climate neutrality or carbon or net zero, or climate neutrality is what they have said, they have not spoken net zero, then the demand for gas from India and from China is going to, India is soon going to follow suit, I'm pretty certain. And therefore the demand from India and China is actually going to be such that, it will have some impact for sure on, an upward movement in the Henry Hub prices. The business models that are now being pursued by the Henry Hub, by the US upstream investors are also very interesting. We have seen a different type of a pricing mechanism evolve now, for, with liquefaction being paid for in capacity terms. So all I can say is that, this $2, $2.5 environment is, yes, we are here now, it does look very difficult, but we've, it's been there before, and it's kind of changed again. Let us not forget that, in 2003 up until 2003, 2004, the US was considered as a net demand sink, and there were 44 applications for regasification terminals in the United States, some of which were then repurposed to become export terminals. So things have changed previously, and so I'm not going to take a view that they will not change in another 10 years' time. They probably will. The other thing which I'm pretty certain will happen is that Europe will continue to remain the largest and the most attractive destination market for international LNG. and the US LNG industry will probably, compete very fiercely for its share of the market. So we will see some competition. We will see some innovative pricing coming out from the traditional European suppliers, including Russia. We've seen and we're monitoring the statement made by Gazprom about making sure that the gas coming in from Russia through the Nord Stream system is in some way decarbonized. Whether that decarbonization actually will take place by the methane stripping or in the German refining industry, or whether it will be delivered as hydrogen, we don't know. It's still very early days, but low carbon gas in Europe is looking real. And if low carbon gas in Europe, which is the largest market in at least at this point in time in the world for international LNG, then then the underlying price dynamics will have to change at some point.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashutosh. Well, are there any questions from the attendees? If not, we are over time in any case. But if anyone does have any questions, please speak now or forever hold your peace, as they say. We can always, of course, field any questions out post-event as well. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, or more broadly about webinars or events moving ahead or anything else, please do get in touch. But really, I'd just like to pose one sort of final question to the panelists before we sort of wrap up really today. I mean, if you had to put the crystal ball, you had a crystal ball and you're looking 5 years ahead, post-COVID, and you had to predict the progress of energy transition in the region, how would you see it panning out in the next 5 years? This is a non-scientific question. You won't be held to it. It's a general, what would you like to see happen and what do you think might see happen?
Well, Nick, I'll start here if I may, and I'll go back to the 4 Ds of the energy transition and the new 4 Ds that are being added in the post-COVID world to this complicated 4 Ds to the energy transition. I think the debt burden that national state governments will have will bring in some a level of austerity measures. It will bring in a certain amount of reticence towards greater international collaboration on climate change. However, highly spoken this subject will become, it will probably again have a lot of airtime, but ultimately financial and investment decisions will be made against the backdrop of this debt burden. And therefore, whether the rapid transition that we all want or all want to see is something that will actually happen in the next 5 years, it remains very, very difficult to predict. And which is why this statement by President Xi at the UNGA, no less, is very significant, because it has, whether it is made for geopolitical effect or whether there is a much deeper strategy behind it, it's very, very early days to say at this point in time. But the next 5 years are definitely difficult.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashutosh. Elfriede.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you. Okay, I do believe that in the coming 5 years we'll have great developments according to our outlook for the energy transition for 2020. Through the coming years, we see that we'll have 4 main drivers for this transition, and this is applicable also for the coming 5 years. That is technology. We will see big developments in terms of technology for hydrogen and CCS, together with renewables, batteries, storage are essential in this process. Policy, we see the European policy in terms of transition, cleaner energy, carbon price, and So policies there, industry, we see a lot of research, a lot of collaboration between oil and gas companies among other players, research institutions, governments. So collaboration between all these players is important for the industry. And again, partnerships, that is the key driver for the coming period of transition going for a cleaner energy. So I see big developments in this regards. I think we have to be conscious that big development means step by step. We won't have everything from today to the next 2-3 days, but we see a big push in this regards, not just from the clean side of the society, but also from the oil and gas players and the industry.
Thank you, Alfreda.
Thank you.
Philip.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'll keep it brief because I know we've gone over time. Yeah, I think in summary, there's sort of two things which I think are important to be able to see, which I think have been missing in terms of policy and creating a framework and environment for energy investments in particular. One is a sort of a get real thing, which is there's been a lot of painting pictures and where we're going and everything else, but the journey to get there has not been set out nearly so well.
Yeah.
And the reality is that things need to happen and investments still need to be made. And, you know, you can't simply say we're shutting the door on all of these things which might have a hydrocarbon associated with it. But there's a reluctance, it seems, to engage in anything that does that. And I think until people get real and say, actually, these investments need to happen, and what we need to do is facilitate that they happen in a carbon neutral way, if you like, which is perfectly feasible, and the technology is there, and actually the cost implications aren't that massive. So it can be done, but if you like, the policymakers need to get real on this and recognise that that there is a role to play, in particular by gas in the medium term. And the second part, and that addresses again to the policy makers, is that there's always a tendency with these things to, you know, to pick on the big ones, you know, around power generation and everything else, whereas the biggest impact in terms of you know, the transition is much closer to home. I mean, the UK government, and Ash has been very, very generous to them in terms of saying, look at the impact we've had. Well, you know, obvious things like new housing. Why on earth would you not say that new housing should be done in a much more, you know, carbon neutral, if not negative way? It's easy. It should be done. It doesn't add costs in there, and yet they've not done it. So there's some easy wins in there, but they're avoiding it because I think it gets a bit close to the perhaps to the voters. So I think that sort of being brave as well as getting real, I think I'd like to see a bit more over the next 5 years if we're actually going to see real impact here.
Thank you very much. And I think anyone that's generous to our politicians in the current climate needs a bit of a medal. So congratulations. But look, ladies and gentlemen, well done, Ash. So look, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank all of our participants for taking the time this morning to come and listen to what was actually a very, very insightful talk, forward-reaching, and I think as Philip just mentioned, you know, what's lacking is perhaps a roadmap to where we want to go in terms of energy transition, and all three of the presentations this morning, I believe, will go some way to providing some of that. So let's hope there are some of those listening in who will take some good information away from this today and everything else. As I say, thank you very much to our speakers and to everyone who took part. Any questions, queries, please do come back to us and be delighted to help in any way after the event. The presentations will be released shortly, and the video will also be uploaded onto the EMC website. So I'm now going to hand back to my colleagues at EMC, who will now show a final short video which will outline our next webinar. So thank you very much. I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you.